What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be going over What Do You Meme's video about 3 reasons why atheists reject the evidence for God. Now, obviously, he is going to be arguing from the very strongest position that he can. There's no way that he's going to present strawman arguments about why atheists are atheists and why they come to the conclusion that the evidence for God does not support the conclusion that a God exists. So, if you want to find out from John McCray or What Do You Meme the 3 reasons why atheists reject the evidence for God, then please stay tuned.
I would love to believe in the existence of God. There's just a single shred of evidence for the existence of God. I mean, anything at all, people, besides the entire universe.
Oh, okay, I get it. So this is kind of like my bro Cephas character.
Wait, what the fuck do you mean character, you son of a bitch?
Okay, I mean bro Cephas, our house guest. So basically, this is supposed to be your character for presenting the really bad arguments that atheists use. I'm not going to criticize any kind of acting. I'm not a great actor either. But anyways, let's cut through a bunch of all this boilerplate stuff that What Do You Meme has at the beginning here. Let's get to the meat of the video.
So I personally noticed an increase of people who would say that they would love to believe in God if there was just a single shred of evidence for the existence of God.
And I would count myself among one of those people. I definitely want to believe in the truth of reality, whatever that truth may be. What I feel like What Do You Meme is getting at here, though, is that people colloquially say that there's just simply no evidence that supports the idea that a God exists. What a more accurate thing to say would be that there's no good evidence that supports that conclusion, because there is evidence that religious people will present in order to prove to you that God exists. But the important thing to focus on, or the important thing about this evidence, is that it does not support the conclusion that they come to. And this isn't about being personally convinced or anything like that. This is simply about the argument being bad, or the evidence being bad and not supporting the conclusion.
But 9 out of 10 times when you try to give them evidence, something disappointing happens. It doesn't matter what you show them, they usually say something like, it's not evidence. That's not evidence either. Nope, not evidence.
Oh, what do you know? My house guest, luckily, is here to give you his 2 cents about how Christians respond to atheists not being convinced of their evidence. What's up there, heathens? My name is Bro Cephas. I am the Christian extraordinaire. I'm here to tell y'all why y'all reject evidence for God. Well, listen, you reject evidence for God just because you hate God. That's right. Yeah, something happened to you in your life, and what do you know? You hate God now, so you're an atheist. Oh, you're an atheist now? That's just because you hear all them fancy fucking accents on the YouTubes out there, and you just want to be like him. Get back, Satan! Go back to hell where the demons live! Go back to hell where you belong, you motherfucker! Get out of here! In Christ's name, I compel you to go to hell! Thank you so much, Bro Cephas. I can guarantee you that at least 2 of those are used in this video today.
And instead of asking them in advance what would count as evidence for the existence of God, those of us who don't value our time very much may follow this rabbit trail. We'll keep giving the person more and more evidence, only for them to just hand wave it all away and claim that it's no evidence at all.
I kind of contest this idea that atheists just sort of hand wave away the supposed evidence that Christians or religious people provide to us. We don't just hand wave it away. We give you reasons as to why they do not support your conclusion. So I don't know why any Christian apologist would present this as just hand waving that shit away like we're in a beauty pageant or something. The only hand-waving that I see ever going on comes from Christian apologists. So I really don't know what in the fuck he's talking about.
Now, there's a few reasons for this possible miscommunication here. Let's just discuss a couple of the most common. First, they seem to think that there's only one kind of evidence.
There's only one kind of evidence. Well, if I had to pick which one that you would most likely think, that would be empirical or scientific evidence. The reason why this would be important is because this is just evidence of reality. This would be evidence that everybody could have access to. This would be independently verifiable evidence. It wouldn't be subjective, really. The scientific method has a great way of removing a lot of bias from your conclusions, if you follow it appropriately. It's even got a mechanism worked within it so that if you're ever proven wrong about something, you can go back and you can work out the actual truth of reality, considering the new information. This is just how reasonable people come to conclusions about reality. Now, are there other kinds of evidence? Sure, there are philosophical arguments for God. This wouldn't necessarily be empirical or physical evidence that God exists, but really just a logical argument that leads to the conclusion that God does exist. But the problem here is that all the philosophical arguments for God seem to fail in one way or another. Just in their basic steps of their syllogisms, or however you want to present the argument, they usually entail something that is false or a leap in logic.
Okay, so for the purposes of this video, the relevant part of this meme is at the very end, where it says, if you propose the existence of something, you must follow the scientific method in your defense of its existence. Otherwise, I have no reason to listen to you.
Okay, so I really disagree with the very last part of this meme, obviously. I don't really like this kind of meme that well, of course, this is what his channel originally started out as, which was, analyzing atheist memes or analyzing memes in general, I guess. But in any case, I disagree with the very last line there. That seems really pretentious. But the first sentence there does seem to be pretty sound. If you make a claim that something does exist, or you make some kind of positive claim, then the burden of proof is upon you in order to prove it with good evidence, not faulty evidence or bad evidence or evidence that doesn't actually lead you to the conclusion that you're trying to get to. The burden of proof is essentially on you.
Now, as this meme seems to imply, it's common for people to think that the only evidence available for the existence of God should be scientific or empirical evidence. And this is probably why they see scientists as some sort of authority on religion.
Now, I'm not going to try and speak for every atheist out there, but I know at least for me, I don't look to scientists as authorities in the field of the philosophical question of whether or not God exists. But I will say that science does come into conflict with religion an awful lot, especially when you get to very specific claims of God. Like when you say, God is necessary for this universe to be here. Well, that's a question that we can definitely answer with science. And we have gotten some really good hypotheses about how the universe could have started without a God. It's just a natural process. And I've talked about this a lot on my channel. I'm sure that I've got some kind of video up here or in the comments that'll kind of help explain it to you. But essentially, it's a natural process, and this intersects with science. So it's not that we look to scientists as authorities on God. It's just that religion regularly makes scientific claims that supposedly only God can explain.
It's because their basic understanding of what counts as evidence is flawed. So first, what is scientific evidence? It's typically evidence that we can verify and measure with our senses that's interpreted by results that are testable and repeatable. But scientific evidence isn't the only type of evidence that there is. So take forensics, for example. You can't measure testable and repeatable events in order to come to a verdict. You won't always have a photo. In trial, non-empirical evidence such as testimony can have serious weight, especially if you can link it with a motive, opportunity, and a means.
Yes, true, but all of that can be overcome with physical evidence, empirical evidence. I don't care how good of a motive or how good of an anecdotal eyewitness statement you have, if it does not match the evidence at hand, then it will be tossed out. Anecdotal eyewitness evidence, in court cases especially, are considered some of the weakest forms of evidence. So while anecdotal evidence is in fact evidence, it's still just anecdotal evidence that can be overridden by the physical evidence. The reason why atheists want physical evidence is that it is the most objective that we can get. Physical evidence. Anecdotal evidence or evidence from eyewitnesses or anything like that is always going to be subjective. But physical or empirical evidence, we can actually get to some kind of objective view of the truth of reality. Considering that a lot of religious experience are very subjective to the person that is experiencing them, that's why we don't accept this anecdotal eyewitness testimony from Christian apologists like John McCray here. That's why we constantly ask for empirical evidence.
So the first thing that we have to realize is that there's different types of evidence. And second, we have to ask, what type of God are these skeptics looking for? For one reason or another, they seem to picture God as some giant man with a long gray beard who's sitting on top of a mountain waiting to be discovered. As if you were able to line up all of the objects in the world, God would just be another one waiting to be discovered by scientists.
I wonder why we think it's some bearded white dude in the sky watching us masturbate at night. Could it be because Christians all throughout time have depicted this asshole just like this? If Christian apologists want to blame anybody for the misconception that God is some bearded white dude in the sky casting magical spells on people, maybe Christian apologists should blame themselves. Because it kind of seems like that's the picture that you want us to have of this God. More to the point though, we don't have to have some like direct empirical evidence of God. Like, I don't need his cape or his toga or whatever in the fuck he might be wearing. I don't need any of that. Just like with a black hole out in space, we can't see a black hole, but what we can see are the effects of the black hole on its immediate surroundings. That's, in fact, how we detect black holes out in space, considering that light can't escape a black hole, therefore we can't see it, we can just see the effects of it. And that's what we would ideally like to see if this God were to exist. We would like to see direct, verifiable evidence that this God has an effect on our reality. So, portraying atheists in a fashion that has them requiring God's toenail clippings or something like that is a straw man against the atheist position, because we don't need that. We just need verifiable evidence of the effects of God in order to show that God most likely does exist. The problem is that there is no evidence like that. Or rather, there's no good evidence that would support the conclusion that God most likely exists.
But Christianity and none of the great monotheistic religions believe in a God like this. They all believe that God is spirit. God's not understood to be another object among the other objects in the world, but instead God's meant to be the grounding of everything that exists. So in other words, he's the author of the whole show.
Yeah, I get that the Christian God is perceived in that way in some of the denominations of Christianity. But, like I said before, all we need is verifiable evidence of the effects of God. If God is the author of everything in reality, then we should definitely be able to determine that he actually is the author of everything in reality. It shouldn't just rely on one old-ass book written by people that thought the earth was flat, which that's the Old Testament. New Testament wouldn't think a flat earth necessarily, but you know. My point is that the idea that a God exists shouldn't totally rest on a book claiming that he does.
Now, science can and does provide evidence for a premise and an argument for the existence of God, but that's not what's going on here. Because asking for empirical proof of the existence of God when God is immaterial is fundamentally illogical. That's like asking for empirical proof of justice or human rights or something. You can't prove something like gay rights by appealing to the scientific method. It's a simple category mistake. Second, the worldview determines in advance what counts as evidence, excluding any possibility for there to be existence for the evidence of God. Another issue is that those who claim that they would love to believe in God, consciously or unconsciously, a lot of the time will set up a criteria that makes it impossible for there to be any evidence for the existence of God.
You know, I really don't see this going on. What I do see is atheists out there claiming that it's very hard to prove that a God exists. And you can't just simply prove that God exists. Like, you can't just sit there and be like, look at the trees, and really expect that to be convincing. I really think that you need hard evidence, like really substantial evidence, in order to prove that this God exists. So I feel like, and maybe John McCray here will get into this, but I feel like a lot of times Christian apologists, they get it in their mind that that the atheists think that it's just impossible to prove God. And so they have solidified themselves in their thinking that God doesn't exist. When in reality, atheists are just saying that you have to have substantial and really, really good evidence to suggest that God exists. That doesn't mean that it's impossible. It just means that it's really hard to prove.
So when my friend David Wood debated Michael Shermer, Shermer said that he would believe in God if there was evidence for the existence of God. But according to Shermer at other times in the debate, he claimed that any evidence that we could find for the existence of God, we could also attribute to super advanced aliens. He said that we wouldn't be able to distinguish if it was really evidence for the existence of God or if it was super advanced aliens. So basically, even though he said he would believe in God if there was evidence for the existence of God, there isn't any possible evidence that we could have for God's existence, because then we could just say that it was aliens or something else. So therefore, in Shermer's criterion, there couldn't possibly be anything that would count as evidence for the existence of God.
John here is piling a lot on to what Michael Shermer said in that debate. I went and I watched the debate, and everything that John McCray just said right here is a misrepresentation of what he meant. Michael Shermer did say that he wanted empirical evidence that this God exists, but he also had a caveat with that. And that caveat was that any phenomena that we could experience that seems to be a miracle or fantastical or breaking the laws of nature is virtually indistinguishable from either magic or advanced alien civilizations. He even gave a really good example of this, being that somebody that was a paraplegic that, couldn't move any other limbs or anything, and they had a microchip embedded in their brain that allowed them to control a cursor on a screen. If you didn't know that there was a microchip there that allowed him to control the cursor on the screen, you would think that he's exercising telekinesis and he is in fact the next Professor X. But that's not exactly the case, because we know about this technology. We know that he's not actually using telekinesis. All Michael Shermer was trying to communicate with that particular example and his statement was that you need really good evidence to distinguish whatever phenomena you experience or whatever event you experience from either just the natural world or an alien civilization. He merely did this to just emphasize how good the evidence has to be. That's it. You really don't need to present strawmans about atheist positions in order to make a good argument. So I have no idea why Christian apologists or apologists in general continuously create these straw man arguments. It just frustrates people that listen to you.
Dawkins says something similar, but instead of pointing to aliens, he points to science. He says that there's nothing beyond the natural and physical world, and that if something appears to lie beyond the natural world, we hope eventually to understand it and embrace it within the natural.
Here's what I don't understand. Why do Christian apologists constantly hearken back to the 2010 group of public atheists? Why is it always about fucking Dawkins and Shermer and Harris and Hitchens and Dennett? Why do they always go back to those people? In any case, if you can sufficiently explain some kind of phenomena within reality, then it becomes natural. So if you have any kind of supernatural event or any kind of event you think is supernatural, and we can eventually explain it naturally, it becomes natural. And that's what Dawkins was saying in that particular section of whatever book he was reading from. That's why generally when I'm talking about proof for God, I say that you have to show a suspension of the natural order of reality. Now that is a really tough criteria to fill there, because you have to come up with something that undoubtedly shows this breaking of the natural order. I don't know what that would look like. I don't know in what form that would come in. But I don't have to know those things to know that that is what would be required in order to prove the supernatural. This is far from proving a particular God exists, let alone just a general idea of God. All we're talking about here is proving that some kind of supernatural realm actually does exist.
So again, we have a criterion that rules out all evidence for the existence of God before you even give the evidence. The same logic you also find applied to miracles all the time. Now, I'm sure that the skeptic would agree that miracles are only possible if God exists, but because the skeptic will often assume that God doesn't exist in advance, then he'll say that miracles are impossible.
I disagree with this point there, John. Mainly because we don't say that miracles are impossible, just that miracles are the least likely event to happen. That's essentially what a miracle is. It's the least likely explanation for any kind of event that happens in reality. Now, does that mean that it's impossible for it to happen? No, obviously not. It just means that out of all the competing hypotheses, it is going to be the very last one to be correct if it were to be correct. Literally any other natural explanation would be far more likely than a miracle explanation. That doesn't mean that it's impossible. That just means it's highly unlikely. Another thing that I don't agree with in this section is this idea that God is required for miracles to happen. I would say that the supernatural is required for miracles to happen because miracles are supernatural by their nature, on top of being the least likely explanation for any event. So because miracles are supernatural by nature, we have to prove that the supernatural exists. And how do we do that? Showing a suspension of the natural order of reality, which is, like I said, extremely tough to do.
He'll say that pretty much anything that appears to be a miracle can't be a miracle because it's impossible for miracles to happen. So again, we have a criterion that asks us to prove miracles, but then rules out any possible evidence for miracles in advance.
You know, I love it how Christian apologists label it's really hard to prove this as it's impossible to prove this. I mean, that's just the weakest argument that you could make about this entire situation here of miracles and proving the supernatural. It's a straw man. This entire video seems to be nothing but straw man arguments against atheists.
Countless examples like this could be given, but I gotta ask, does this sound fair to you? Or does it sound more like cheating?
I mean, I don't know. I feel like it's kind of cheating to straw man your opponent, beat down that straw man and act like you won. I don't know. That kind of seems like cheating to me.
If our criterion is set up where literally nothing can count as evidence for the existence of God, then is this criterion really set up for skeptics to find the truth? Ironically, those with this setup are usually the same people who say that religious people can't see the evidence for things like evolution because their worldview gets in the way. And here they are.
Well, a lot of times for fundamentalist Christians, they have trouble seeing past their dogmatic views. So that is a fair criticism of a certain group of Christians. I wouldn't say that that's a fair criticism of all Christians as like a generalization. But also, I think it's funny how John McCray here has to twist the atheist position on this in order to make it similar to how some Christians act.
And lastly, the problem is not really the evidence.
It's not the evidence? I mean, I'm wondering where he's going with this, but I can guarantee you it's definitely a problem with the evidence. Because the evidence is just not good at all. It does not prove the conclusion that a God exists. This evidence is poor. At every single turn, every single argument, every single piece of evidence that I've been presented with by Christian apologists and Christians in general, they all fail in their very basic steps. They either fail logically or they make logical leaps in order to get to their conclusions. So yes, it is a problem with the evidence.
Now for some of them, if you show them evidence, you'll find that they don't really mean that there's no evidence for the existence of God. Instead, what they mean is that the evidence that you showed them doesn't personally persuade them. What they really mean is that they don't find the evidence personally convincing.
Well, yes, so I do find it personally unconvincing, but it's personally unconvincing because of the problems with the arguments. Or it's unconvincing because of the logical leaps that you have to make to get to your conclusion. And I feel like those are fair reasons to disregard these pieces of evidence.
But if this is the case, then it's really about their personal psychology. It's not really about the evidence. And if a person is defining evidence to mean anything that will change their personal psychology, then that would require you to delve into their conscious and their unconscious reasons for rejecting the existence of God. These reasons could be intellectual. They also could be emotional reasons, such as they had bad experiences with religious people.
This is one of those dumb fucking things that Procephus mentioned earlier. I like how John in this particular section blew right past the intellectual reasons why to reject the evidence. And he goes straight for the straw man of emotional reasons. Reasons like, oh, your priest slapped you in the face and therefore you hate God and that's why you're an atheist. This may represent a few people out there, but it does not represent the majority of atheists. And the way that this particular apologist is presenting it makes it seem like he's generalizing it for the entire atheist crowd. Albeit, in this video, he does say that there are some intellectual atheists out there, but he seems to be speaking from a position of generalization, like the intellectual atheists out there are the outliers, and that the majority of atheists are just these dumb fucking people that are convinced by emotions that God doesn't exist. This is such a bad straw man.
Maybe they simply didn't like the religion that they were brought up in, or they were raised by some weirdo, strange religious people, or they were treated poorly at church, or any number of reasons. There could also be social reasons involved, such as they found themselves liking non-religious people more and wanted to be more like those non-religious people. Or maybe they were persuaded by the British accents of the pop atheists and mistook that for thinking that they had brilliant arguments, or whatever.
I don't know if those last couple of things were all that serious coming from John here, but if they were, that's just sad for him. To present atheists out there, it's just liking the way somebody else talks, or liking some group of people more, and so they decide not to believe in God. You're really trivializing the journey of an atheist. Like the journey from being in the faith to leaving the faith. Like, that's an entire process right there. And there are plenty of atheists out there that never had to go through that were never religious in their past. But to present it like John McCray does in this video just really shits on the personal journeys of so many atheists out there. I know myself, I was struggling with my faith when, I had a friend who told me that you had to believe in the Bible, in the inerrant word of the Bible, cover to cover in order to be a true Christian. Obviously, I know now that that is a no true Scotsman fallacy. But at the time, I had no idea what in the fuck that was. All I knew was that I trusted my friend, and if he told me this, then it's probably true, so I'm not a true Christian. Because there's obviously things in the Bible that I do not believe. And so I started my journey. I started reading about several different topics, all concerning the question of whether or not God exists. I had never explored the other side of the argument. I had always been told that God definitely does exist, and that you should try to do your best to be a good person so that you can go to heaven instead of going to hell, where Satan will shove a pineapple up your ass every day. That's what I was told as a kid, minus the pineapple part. And so I had never looked at the other side of the argument. And once I did, I really couldn't deny what the other side was pointing out about my own faith. And it eventually all came crashing down, and I had to admit to myself, as hard as it was, that I was an atheist. In this video, John McCray kind of makes it out to be like somebody becoming an atheist or deconverting out of religion is some kind of easy thing that can be accomplished by just wanting to be with the in crowd, or you like how somebody talks and so therefore you want to be just like them and become an atheist. He trivializes the reasons why people become atheists. And this is just so fucking frustrating at this point.
These are the kind of things that have influence on whether we choose to accept the existence of God or not. And the same logic applies to religious people. But as you can imagine, this can get very complex very, very quickly. So if there's things in their minds that they may not even be consciously aware of, then there's no possible way that you can maneuver through all of these things in order to get them to feel personally persuaded by the evidence.
Well, thus, why I would suggest for Christian apologists, as well as you fellow heathens out there, don't try to persuade somebody to your position. I don't ever try to persuade anybody to my position. I argue against people that are presenting bad information, people that have a misconception about certain scientific topics or certain topics concerning atheism. I try to educate them with good information about my own personal experience or about why this particular philosophical argument doesn't prove your particular version of God. I argue against them, but that's not me wanting to try and change their mind about God. And I think that this is one of the fundamental problems with apologists, especially on YouTube apologists, is that their goal is to get you to change your mind to be what they think. They don't want you to think your own thoughts. They want you to think their thoughts, or to think at least in the same ballpark as what they're thinking. They don't want you to have the free will, if you will, the ability to have your own thoughts, because everybody has to think the exact same way as these Christians. And this not only extends to atheists, but it extends to, all manner of religions and non-religious people out there that are not Christian.
So, in conclusion, what do we do with this? Well, if you value your time, then I would suggest that you ask people up front what counts as evidence for the existence of God. Because in order for someone to claim that there's no evidence for something, they first have to say what the evidence would look like if the thing existed.
So I definitely agree with this point. The idea that first you've got to be able to understand what the other person means by evidence, or what the other person considers evidence. And then once you come to an agreement about what that evidence is, or what evidence in general is, then you can have a conversation about it. And also, and I cannot stress this enough, if indeed you are out there presenting some kind of case where God is just impossible to prove or to exist, then I would caution you against that. Because even in science, we leave a small sliver, a small little bit of room for something to be false or for the alternative to be true. But with new information, we can overturn decades-long ideas about our reality, but you have to be able to allow that change to happen. And that's the fundamental difference, at least from what I've experienced, between atheists and Christians and Christian apologists. Atheists are far more open-minded, most of the time, about God and evidence for God, but Christians and apologists in general out there, religious people in general, seem to be far more closed-minded to the possibility that anything else could be true other than their own worldview. So in this case, it's not the atheists that are closed-minded or that have presented an argument that is unfalsifiable. It's actually the religious people out there, the religious apologists, that have presented an argument that is unfalsifiable to them. Nothing can change their mind, which I think is kind of ironic considering that John McCray in this particular section is complaining about how atheists, their minds can't be changed.
So the next time someone says that there's no evidence for the existence of God and they only accept scientific evidence, or they won't accept any evidence at all, what are you going to say?
Hopefully you'll say something like, let's have a conversation about it. Why don't you think these things? Well, here's this piece of evidence. How about we have a conversation? I would hope that you do that instead of spit off some kind of dumb fucking catchphrase that you use for your channel. Anyways, heathens, that's going to be it for the video today. I would love to hear what you think about John McCray's points in this video. Do you think that he's got some solid points? Do you know some atheists out there that act exactly like he is claiming that atheists act? Or do you yourself present an unfalsifiable model against God? Let me know down in the comments below. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of video. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.